Thank you, thank you. Yeah, as Jed said, I'm from Queensland on the Sunshine Coast, so this is actually my first React Sydney event ever. So thank you all for having me. It's very exciting to be here tonight. Yeah, I'm going to be talking about accessibility in design systems, so let's get into it. So yeah, I'm Jordan and I work at a company called Thinkmill that you all know. But for the last year, I've been working with the Federal Australian Government's Department of Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestries on a new open source design system. As it is open source, all the code is available to view on GitHub and we publish everything to NPM as well. So I've put a little link there if anyone's interested in checking that out. And at the end of last year, we undertook a big accessibility and usability audit, which was facilitated by a company called Intopia. And so what we're going to be talking about tonight is firstly, what is the agriculture design system, followed by a summary of the accessibility and usability audit that went last year. And finally, we're going to look at how our team approached accessibility and usability at a design system level. So let's get into it by looking at what is AgDS. So to give you all some visual context, this is our storybook kitchen sink example, which is essentially just a dump of all of our components in the system in no particular order. And we're using Storybook here because it's a really great tool for being able to switch between what we call our light palette and dark palette, and you can see all the components respond nicely to that color change. And AgDS is also a themable system. So in this video right now, I'm switching between what we call the agriculture theme, which is what we use in the department, to what is known as the gold theme. And we're going to take a look at what gold is in just a minute. So as you can see, one part of AgDS is a React component library. But at a higher level, it's really a shared language between the design, development, and content practitioners at the department. As well as the components that you just saw, we do have templates for common page compositions and patterns that exist in the department. And for the designers, we have a Figma library where all the components and tokens live. So in the video, I demonstrated switching between the agriculture theme and the gold theme, and a lot of you probably don't know what gold is, so we're going to look into that right now. Gold is an open source design system for building government services and products. And there's the URL if anyone's interested in looking at that later. And it's designed to replace the former Australian government design system, which was being funded by the DTA, but unfortunately decommissioned in 2021. Gold and AUDS has been widely used across many government products before, so Department of Health, Department of Veterans Affairs, as well as New South Wales government at some point have used Gold or AUDS before. And it's no secret that gold has been the inspiration for AgDS. We've really tried to take the aesthetic and design principles, but extend that to meet the needs of the department. And the main reason for that is because gold did a really good job in terms of usability and accessibility. So a lot of research went into the development of gold, and we wanted to leverage as much of that as possible. But gold was built a long time ago, and things move very quickly in tech. So I like to think of AgDS as a modern interpretation of gold. So we've built everything from the ground up using React and TypeScript, and all the styling is done with Emotion, which is another Thinkmill package for CSS and JS. And we have a bunch of really cool shiny toys for our monorepo setup and documentation site. So at a really high level, this is the architecture of the design system. We have the components, which are things that you typically think of when you think of a design system. So things like button or accordion or a select component. But really they are a composition of our primitive components. So things like box and columns and text. We expose these components to our consumers to also build components that we don't have in the system. But the cool thing with primitive components are they're really flexible, and they have these style props which allow us to interact with our design tokens. So the values for color, typography, border, etc. We have a nice way of referencing those values in React in a way that's both type safe and works in a responsive way as well. So as an example of that, here's our global alert component that typically sits at the top of the page. You can see it's got a background color with an icon and some typography. And really the code for this component is pretty simple. It's just a composition of flex, box, and an icon and a couple of buttons in there as well. But this syntax might look weird at first for people who aren't familiar with this, but it is a really powerful and flexible way for handling styling in our design system. And yeah, just as I mentioned before, it's really good to be able to make sure everything's mapped back to our tokens correctly. So let's get into the accessibility audit. As mentioned, it was facilitated by a third-party company called Intopia. Neither the department nor Thinkmill has any affiliation with them whatsoever, but they did a fantastic job. And the audit was split up into 3 phases. So we did an audit of the components in isolation, followed by an audit of our page templates and documentation site, which is built using the design system components. And finally, we had some usability sessions, and these sessions were with users who had specific accessibility requirements. So things like a screen reader. We had some low vision users who needed screen magnification software, or a neurodivergent user as well. So having Storybook for this phase was amazing because it does such a good job at being able to provide a playground for testing components in isolation. So in this video, I'm just stepping through our text input component, seeing all the different variations that it can be in, and the auditors had a nice little playground down the bottom for changing all the props and performing their checks on. So phase 1, what we're looking for here is making sure the components respond nicely to both screen reader and keyboard input, making sure the components respond nicely when placed in Windows high contrast mode. When you zoom up all the way to 400%, make sure everything responds nicely. Of course, making sure that colors have sufficient contrast between background and foreground elements. And as well, just making sure the HTML is valid. There was quite some cases where we're rendering a div instead of a span in some cases, which yielded some HTML validation errors, which can cause a lot of issues for screen readers. But pretty proud to say our team got an 80% pass for AA compliance before we did any remediation work. And a couple of issues that came out of this phase were things like a button loading state. What we're doing is we have a loading prop on the button, and when that's true, we just overlay the text with some loading dots. But what we actually had to do was make sure there was a ARIA live region inside the button, and when the loading prop is true, we insert the text that we want to be announced to the screen reader, because simply just toggling the buttons on and off, with the ternary operator wasn't enough for some screen readers. Things like Windows high contrast mode, our date range picker, the selected date range you can't see in Windows high contrast mode because we were relying on background color alone. So what we had to do was make sure we put a font weight to indicate that, as well as an outline on the selected dates. Here's an example of content not reflowing when you zoom all the way to 400%. So we forgot to add some scrolling to our main nav component on the left here, so you couldn't see the items that were cut off by your screen. Cool. And then phase 2, once we made all the fixes that were caught there, we moved on to phase 2, where we audited the templates and documentation site. Here's an example of one of the templates we offer. It's just a simple sign-in form. Although it is a really, really simple layout, it does a good job of demonstrating how different components can be composed together on a page. So we have some skip links at the top of the page, followed by main nav, followed by main content area and a footer. And then we have a form with client-side validation. We have a button with a loading state to mimic an API response call, and then we have an API response returning an error. And we're just testing here that our components fit nicely when placed together on a page, and that we're managing focus correctly as well. And yeah, did pretty good job in that phase as well. We got 86% pass for AA compliance. A lot of the issues that came out of this were on our documentation. We have like a live code editor for some snippets, and there was a couple of issues there with keyboard input. But Yeah, once that was done, we moved on to the usability sessions. And what we were doing, we were observing users with specific accessibility requirements, so screen readers, etc. And what we asked them to do was register a pet for a fake government service that we created. So I'm just going to let this video play and talk a little bit about what's going on. This is a form flow for registering a pet for a fake government service. So the reason for why we built this instead of using a product that exists in the department already was that in order to use some of these products, you need quite specific domain knowledge in agriculture, which is really hard to recruit for. So what we decided to do was take the UI and UX patterns that exist in the department, which is like taking these huge forms, like hundreds of form fields long, and they get split up into multiple tasks, which then gets further split up into multiple sections, and the user has stepped through that in a flow. We tried to mimic that as best as we could using something that just a regular user could understand. So here we're just registering a fake pet. And some of the findings that came out of this were really fascinating. So the screen reader users, they provided overall positive feedback. They were able to navigate around the page using shortcuts and interact with keyboards, interact with our components using keyboard input as expected. But the visual users were pretty confused by some elements on the page. They were confused by some icons looking like radio buttons or unclear with some copy that was on the page as well. So we knew we had to do some work for our visual users. So before we made any changes, here's what one page in that form looked like. And here's after. So I'll just quickly show before and after again. So some things to note, we added some color and made the progress indicator, which is what you see on the left, make it more look like a timeline of step tasks rather than just these individual tasks that can be completed in any order. Added some subheading above the progress indicator as well to make it more clear what step you're on. We consulted with the content team to make our labels in that component as clear as possible. And finally, down the bottom here, this is our summary list component. We made sure that the key and the value were as close as together as possible because a lot of users thought that they were confused. They weren't sure that the key and the value were related. They were like, well, this one thing's all the way over here, and this is over here. And this was really interesting to me because it showed that accessibility does not mean usability. You can spend a lot of time making everything as accessible as possible, but as soon as you get it in front of your users, they might not understand what that means. So it's really important that usability sessions happens early. So at the end of this three-phase approach, Intopia gave the AgDS team a certificate of compliance, and they said that, hey, you guys did a great job, and because it's open source, that we can now, any issues that come up in the future, we can show that to potential future clients as well, saying here's how you can implement accessible React-based design system in the future. So that was great, but that was no accident. There was a lot of hard work that went into making that possible. So I wanted to share with you how we tackle that as a team. Cool, so let's get into it. I think the main reason for this is that we make accessibility a core pillar of AgDS. It's really fundamental to everything that we do. So whenever a design decision is made or a code change is made, we're asking ourselves, is this the most accessible thing we can do, or is there an alternative solution? And it does take a lot of time, but it is really fundamental to what we do, and we have that printed on our website, so it's really easy to rationalize that. It is quite easy to justify this time spent doing that because, yeah, it is a government service and we are legally obliged to make it as accessible as possible. But I think for private companies who don't have that same requirement, you still have to find the reason why accessibility is important to you and write that somewhere, because if you don't, it can very easily fall through the cracks. Another thing we do is our way of working. So we have a philosophy that design is everyone's job, and by design, I don't really mean like jumping into Figma and changing border radiuses of components and things like that. I mean, design as in the act of problem solving. So whenever a problem is brought to us, we jump on a call together and discuss what needs to be done, and that's both with engineers and design, and it gives everyone an opportunity to bring their areas of expertise in and just catch things early rather than a traditional software setup where you have designers in one room and developers in another room, and the developers just do whatever the designers say and slap some ARIA tags on the end and try and make it accessible. We just try and do everything in a collaborative manner. And the other thing that we do is we try and get things into code as quickly as possible. So while Figma is an awesome tool for coming up with ideas and testing ideas quickly, it is just a picture at the end of the day. So it's not what the end user is going to see. So being able to get ideas into code quickly, testing with a screen reader, testing with keyboard, seeing how it behaves in a real browser is amazing for us. And that's not just unique to our team, it's just the standard way of working at Thinkmill, and Boris and Jed have done a great job of publishing that on the Thinkmill website. So there's a link if anyone's interested in that. And here's a tool that we use for prototyping in code. It's called Playroom, and for those who are unaware, it's just a website you can visit. And what you get is a code editor down the bottom with all your components loaded in. So you get autocomplete, and there's some snippets you can use. And at the top, you have a live demo of your code down the bottom, and you can preview in a bunch of different screen sizes, which you can configure. And you can share that around your team as well. The URL is synced up to the code, and so not only is this an awesome tool for us to use internally to be able to just jump into this, write some code, share it with the designers, but usually we have some designers or developers come to us and say, hey, like, what's the most accessible way to do this or do that? And it's awesome just to jump on a call with them, show them Playroom, do it together, and then they can fix the problem in their code base. So yeah, this has been an amazing tool for us. Another thing that we do is we make sure to manually test in as many different browsers and assistive technologies as possible. I know as engineers we love to automate as much as possible, but unfortunately there are just so many issues that aren't captured in automated testing. WCAG published an article saying that only something like 30% of accessibility issues can be captured with automated tests. So there's just no way around not doing manual testing. So we try and do a bunch of different manual testing with every code change or design change. And I just wanted to give a shout out to this website called Assistive Labs. It is like Browser Stack, but for screen readers. So you can remotely log on, test a website in NVDA or JAWS or VoiceOver, Windows High Contrast as well. So yeah, that's a really great tool for testing. And finally, having multiple references, multiple respected accessibility references, I should say. So whenever you want to build something new, it's good to reference how someone's done it before. So I always love to reference the Working ARIA Initiative, WAI ARIA Authoring Practice Guide. They have a really clear guidance on how to implement, modern components such as dialogue or sliders or carousels or anything like that. But it is quite verbose, and the code is very outdated at times. So seeing how people tackle those issues in a more modern application like WK or Reach UI, React ARIA, Radix UI is really useful as well. Cool. So to wrap up, I think accessibility needs to be made a priority, not just a nice to have. Check out the Thinkmill method, because the method of working has a direct impact in the accessibility of an application. And finally, do not solely rely on automated testing. There's just no way around it yet. And thank you so much. Any questions, or otherwise I'll leave it at that. Yeah, just a bunch of different devices. So, phone, iPad, a laptop, a small tablet as well, and just yeah, tried to do a bunch of Windows as well as Apple as well. Um, yeah, yeah. I don't think there's like a silver bullet or anything. Just yeah, just yeah, mainly for other government departments to use as well that are not in the Department of Agriculture. Um, yeah, the government are trying to work more in the open, but yeah, a lot of people don't. But yeah, mainly just to mainly to allow other government departments to pick it up in the future, hopefully, as a almost gold replacement one day potentially. Good question. Maybe engaging with a third-party accessibility company would be good because they can perform those audits and give you that certificate of compliance. But if you're just doing it on your own, you kind of just saying, yeah, like trust me in a way. But you can use the WCAG guidelines as your baseline. They do have pretty clear guidance, like saying this type of component needs to respond to these keyboard events. Uh, in order to do this pattern, you need these elements. So you can follow that, but it is quite verbose. Yeah, great question. We decided not to use any, well, try not to use any external libraries at first because we were trying to be a gold replacement at first, which had almost zero, basically zero dependencies. But as the design system grew, we needed like a combo box component. So in that case, we use downshift. Yeah, I know. Yeah. Yeah. But yeah, there's like some things that like yeah, we would save a lot of time by using like Radix or Reach UI, but we didn't want to be locked in to their way of thinking. Like I think Reach UI is great, but they just like got deprecated and don't support React 18, which is like, oh man, like if you're relying on them, what do you do? Great question. I don't think we've reached that bridge yet, but yeah, hopefully other departments can take this as a starting point and extend it and change it to meet the needs of their department because every department has quite specialized requirements. But yeah, I mean, it is possible now for another department to pick it up and theme it, but we haven't seen that just yet. So yeah, we'll see. Emotion is great for design systems right now. It doesn't really require too much build tooling, so getting it into existing products who have ways of styling, like we can incrementally adopt components without having to change too much. I know a lot of Thinkmill people are exploring vanilla extract and some other cool styling libraries, but we've gone with the classic emotion for now. The classic Thinkmill design system stack.